Thanks very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Seeing no one's in the public here. So but we'll just move on here. I'm just like to call the special council meeting for Thursday, the 12th of December to order. Quickly, we respectfully acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples represented by the Kasepsum and Zongis nations. Item 2, approval of the agenda. May I have a mover and seconder for tonight's special council? Thank you very much, Councilor Crowe and Councilor Ward. Any opposed? Seeing none, I will move on to, there is nobody from the public here tonight, so I'm going to skip over that item. We shall move on to item 4, which is unfinished business. We have no unfinished business. We move on now to new business. Over to you, Jen, and it's going to be an exciting night. And I just like to do a prelude to this. After going through this from end to end a couple times, I just want to comment to you and your team. This is the very best presentation you guys have put together for the budget. It's so self-explanatory that I still have questions, but it was so well done. And I'm just telling you how pleased I am. I've sat through many of these, even at the CRD, and the way that you and your team have put this together, it's even a simpleton like me can understand it very easily. So well done to you and your team. On that note, over to you, Jen.
Thank you, Mayor Kobayashi. I'll make sure the team is aware of that. We certainly did put an increased focus on the presentation materials this year. Just a quick recap in the event that anyone's joining us online who hasn't yet in this process. The last meeting was really that review of the reserves and the deep dive into our capital plan. This council has already done a deep dive into our operating budgets throughout the service review that was held earlier this year. The purpose of tonight's meeting really is almost threefold. One, review revenue highlights where we didn't discuss those revenues during service review. In addition, go through each of our 21 service areas at a very high level. My intention here is simply to remind us of the level of service that was directed and any highlights, primarily from a budget perspective. Our team is in attendance tonight. Should council have any questions, they'll join me up here. Otherwise, it's intended to be an overview of that process that we undertook earlier. Financial plan highlights, specifically really what we're referring to here is an understanding of what is driving the increases to our property taxation. And we will get into that tonight. And then, as you know, we do have another meeting scheduled this Monday. Monday, the intention is to return with staff recommendations. So please, similar to before, at any time, interject should you have questions. The purpose of this first slide here, the graphic, this is looking at the total revenue for our 2025 budget. So it's both, the operating revenue, which is approximately $36 million for the city this coming year, as well as our sewer utility revenue, which is another $3 million, as well as capital revenue. And so that sort of upper quadrant, the developer contributions, that 22% there, that absolutely will fluctuate both with the level of development activity in the city as cash is contributed to our reserves, but also as our capital plan aligns expenditure of our DCCs, we do need to budget for that revenue. So the developer contributions and the capital grants is also referenced within that 22%. That certainly fluctuates depending on our capital plan year to year. The next slide really speaks to the remainder. So this is an infographic of the city's general operating revenue, that $36 million that I referenced. Not unlike municipalities, the local government level, we are heavily reliant on property taxation. That is in part why, of course, that is often what, hits the headlines, is understanding that impact, because that is our primary source of revenue, that property taxation and our user fees. That is how we sustain the majority of our service delivery. And so as you can see at Colwood, almost 70% of our operating revenue, it is our property tax base. We'll talk in a little bit of further detail about why we split out new construction. As you know, it's one of the policies that's endorsed by council with our sustainable infrastructure plan. And it's really important that we identify that revenue separately, just because we do utilize that revenue, one, to fund, the service delivery that needs to sort of expand with the growth of the city. But we're also setting aside some of those dollars year to year into our reserves. And so, that new construction, it is part of our general tax base, but we will, for budgetary purposes, talk about it separately, identify it separately. We'll talk a little bit about payments in lieu of taxes. The cities, we do consider this tax revenue as well. 2025, we're budgeting $3.1 million. This is primarily driven by the federally owned properties here within the city of Colwood. And we'll go into that in a little bit of detail. Investments, as you heard from me a couple of nights ago, we utilize that funding to fund our reserve transfers. And tonight I'll highlight just where we believe investment returns will generate for 2025. The utility that represents 1% of our general operating revenue. So this is a legislative requirement. Utility companies that operate within the city of Colwood, they are required to pay us, 1%, in some cases 3% of their revenues generated in lieu of taxation. And so that revenue also funds, our core operations.
Just a quick question on that one. 2 questions, 3 questions actually. So of the taxation, of course, there's the residential portion and then the commercial portion. Can you tell me how that's split now? Are we getting better? Is the commercial starting to come up a little bit, or?
It is starting to come up, but not quite to the same pace as the residential.
Okay.
I can certainly report out the trend on Monday's meeting. We do disclose that annually with our annual report. But our current assessment roll is approximately 7.5 billion. 7 billion is residential, 500 million is commercial.
But I know
And
there's
then
different mill rates on it.
And then the mill rates, yeah, absolutely. So we're still closer to that 4 times on the business.
Okay.
But
Okay.
we can certainly bring that back.
It's just out of interest to see how we're doing on that, because if you look at the revenue right now, it's so hard. The majority of it comes from taxation. So you look at how can we improve on that. The biggest bite is taxation. Can't keep taxing people, but maybe working on the commercial. So yeah, that's a different discussion for a different day. My second question is the investment income. Do we invest all our money through MFA? Is that how we do it here? We don't have separate investments, do we?
We do have somewhat diversified investments. It's not all with the MFA,
Okay.
but a portion of, I don't have the percentage split off top of mind, but it's with the MFA's pooled savings. And yeah.
And so my last question, final question, are we still sort of following a traditional trend here as far as the percent? Because I kind of remember these numbers before, and so I think they're about the same, right, over the last 2 or 3 years.
Sorry, the trend in terms of the proportionate allocation of our operating revenues?
Yeah.
Somewhat. Where it does fluctuate is with respect to the service areas, which is primarily the user fees related to building and development. And so that, if you looked at the trend kind of in 5-year increments, that is fluctuating, but more or less, and investment returns will have somewhat of an impact, but overall, more or less, yes, we've been close to that 75% reliance on property taxation.
Perfect. Thanks very much.
And then this slide really is just intended, when we refer to service area operating revenue, the majority of those revenues are related to the building, the engineering, works and services administration fees, development services fees. that is what makes up the majority of what we're now referring to as sort of our service areas. And so those revenues we discussed in detail during service review earlier this year. And they are, allocated directly to those service areas. But as you've heard us reference, there certainly are costs in other areas of, city delivery that do rely on this revenue overall. The intention of this infographic, when we consider sort of all of our tax related revenues, we're at about $28 million for the city. So the majority of that general taxation, and then of course the payments in lieu of taxes. We've got about 12% of that total tax going into our reserves right now. And we had a little bit of a conversation about this 2 nights ago in terms of, is that too high? Is that too low? And I really appreciate that. And that's something that we should be looking at, monitoring that and benchmarking that and understanding what our target should be. Protective services, and these references here, these are local government segmented references. So that represents there a third of our tax dollars supporting policing, fire, building and bylaw, planning and development. That's the 5% that's going to support our development services, community planning. General government tends to refer to your, sort of internal service administration, corporate services, finance, IT, GIS, HR, communications and engagement. Solid waste for the city is we don't do the garbage pickup with our residences, but we do have garbage collection within city parks, boulevards, as well as the branch drop-off program. Parks, Rec and Culture, that's our library requisition, our events, arts and culture budget, as well as, of course, our parks, trails and recreation. Engineering, public works related areas, that's 14% of our taxes. And then the debt servicing, we identify that separately in part because, it's not necessarily that these service areas have direct control over whether or not aspects of their delivery are funded through debt servicing or reserves. And so we show that independently. And so right now, 2% of our tax dollars are going to support the servicing of the city's debt.
That's very tough to benchmark, isn't it? Because every city does something a little bit differently, right? So, so you can't tell how well, if this is good or bad. It's so hard, isn't it?
I don't have a direct answer on that, but yes, some cities have, they have policy in place. There are municipalities that will highlight, we don't utilize debt. There's a time and a place, and it can ensure that you've got the service delivery. If you don't have the sustainable reserves, it can ensure that you're able to maintain your infrastructure. So there's certainly a time and a place. And as you know, we've brought on the debt for a number of active transportation improvements in the city, as well as the public works operations facility. New construction taxation, this is the first time that we've sort of given the public a bit of a deeper view into what is driving and expanding our tax base, and so as we look ahead 1 year out, we have pretty decent information at this point in time. And what I mean by that is BC Assessment will provide us with an estimated assessment roll that summarizes incremental changes. So the non-market change is what it's referred to. And so then we'll look at this and utilizing existing tax rates, come up with an estimate for what we believe our additional tax dollars will be. And so right now we're looking at an estimate of about $1.2 million. The financial plan a year ago for 2025 estimated $800,000. So of course, it is important that we are monitoring this and understanding this because we do have demands on our services. You heard from us during a number of service areas about the impact of growth. And so as we are, for example, staffing up our parks team, we're looking to this revenue to fund that so that we're not driving a tax increase to respond to simply the growth within the community. So this year, primarily it's Colwood Corners, Royal Bay, Beachlands, the Allendale District that is generating that expanded tax base. This estimate will be improved with the revised roll that we'll receive in March of 2025. So payments in lieu of taxation, as I mentioned, the majority of this revenue is generated from the federally owned properties within the city. So Belmont Park, along Ocean Boulevard, Fiskard Lighthouse, Royal Roads University lands. The provincial PILT, we do receive a grant for the public post-secondary institution, Royal Roads. And we also have a couple of provincial rental housing properties within the city. The other is the arrangement with the Brooks School. And so looking ahead to 2025, we're anticipating closer to about $3.5 million. We do maintain somewhat of a allowance from a budgetary perspective. These PILT revenues, with my experience here, they have fluctuated year to year. And there are areas that are under review and that could impact future revenues. And so we do keep a bit of an allowance from a budgetary perspective. But similar to our general taxation, these dollars are they're treated no differently, and they do fund city service delivery as a whole. When we consider the forecast for our investment income, right now, our rates of return are fluctuating between 4% and 6%. Our investments are restricted under the community charter. So the bulk of the city's funds, they're held within high interest pooled savings account, GICs. This is absolutely an area that has our attention, but it doesn't have our direct attention. We have informed council we will be back. One, to bring forward an updated investment policy for consideration. The last time we reviewed this policy was 2009. But also to report out on, the current composition and the activity related to these funds. So we do have that scheduled for this coming year. And as you heard from me 2 nights ago, we do keep an eye on our cash flow forecasting. It's also important that we do have that we keep this funding, much of it liquid, looking at our financial plan when we anticipate expenditure. We need to be able to access these funds. And so it's one area that this coming year we'll be bringing back further detail on. But when we reviewed, the increases in our anticipated reserve balances over the next 5 years, it's in part driven by these higher rates of returns than we've received in previous years. And so that's really touching on the aspects of revenue that we haven't previously done a deep dive into. And now we'll move along into the service review highlights. And this image here really, similar to where do our tax dollars go, but this is overall when we simply compare the operating budgets between major city service delivery area. So 23% policing, admin corporate services, 13%, public works, 13%, and then decrease from there. So just to give you an idea of overall, from a financial perspective, where the bulk of the financial activity is to support city service delivery. And so we'll move in. We've got, as 21 defined service areas, starting with administration and corporate services. the direction received was to maintain this level of service. We did have some, from a budgetary perspective, the highlights included the consideration of formalizing a cost-sharing arrangement with the Sault School District. Since service review, I have received word the sort of major municipalities that they refer to, their largest, Colwood, Langford, that there certainly is a discrepancy in terms of the proportion that the municipalities are paying versus the district. Colwood right now, we're closer to, I think it's about 25%. It's being proposed to move to 50. The information shared with respect to Langford, they're paying a higher proportionate share. So that is something we will be returning to, that our operating budget has been prepared with the expectation that we'll move forward with a 50-50 cost sharing arrangement for the crossing guard support within our elementary schools.
Who's by law, by bylaw, or whatever policy, who is responsible for that though? This just seems wrong to me right now.
All of the conversations that I have had have led me to the belief that this is somewhat of a gray area. And I say this, when you consider traffic responsibility, that is commentary that I've received from the Sault School District, that the municipality does have a role and a responsibility. However, the administration of staffing at our public schools in our community lays with Sault School District. So in my experience here, it has not yet been formalized, certainly from a budgetary perspective, and I expect the school district would feel the same way. It would be very helpful to have clarity on what the expectations are. But the conversations that I have had there, that clarity does not exist right now.
I would go with the position myself personally. If we are going to go up, then we need time. We need time to put it in our future budgets. I wouldn't do it in this particular fiscal year. That's my starting position on it, period. But I don't know how the rest of the council feels about that, but that's where I would go with this. It's worrisome to me because, like I said, there's gray areas right now. Yeah. So the go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. My understanding is the additional crossing guard at Victoria at Chosen Road was added. I don't know who is paying and if that has put us up, but we can't delay that because we need that. That crossing guard is needed now, right? It's crucial.
I'm not too sure which one you're talking about.
At Lagoon Road and Chosen.
Oh,
no, not Victoria.
Yeah. Thank you for your comment. Councillor Wilson?
Just in response to Councillor Grove, I do recall that we, in a meeting, I think it was last year, there was a parent of a child that went to Sangster that had come forward and requested the city provide a crossing guard at the Latoria-Machosen spot. And I believe, I'd have to look back in minutes, that council agreed to provide a crossing guard there, that we would explore having a crossing guard there. And I believe we did agree to that. Just saying, I'm not sure what the cost of these like you say, a 50-50 split. Can you just enlighten us with what the cost is?
Certainly, the updated costing that we've received from the district is approximately $10,000 a year per crossing guard. And a little bit higher. We don't have the operating budget on the screen before us, but the incremental cost for Colwood at 50% of adding 3 crossing guards is $17,000.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, just having crossing guards at those locations, especially in our own community. I understand that it's a school district expense. They should be covering it, but I don't know. That's a tough one. I think we'd have to talk about it further, but.
Yeah, I'm not against it at all. So don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that it does need clarity. That's for sure. Thanks very much. Let's proceed. Oh, sorry, Councillor Ward. Sorry.
Yeah, I agree. I just think it's something we should look into a little bit, get a better understanding of what's going on around the region. I mean, just at a quick glance, I can see that City of Victoria, for example, funds 100%. But Saanich doesn't, and there's a dispute between the two, even though it's the same district, the SD61 was funding, well, as of April 2024, 100% of the crossing guards within Saanich. So there is no kind of clear model. And I think, fair isn't always equal. I think that's a mistake a lot of people make. And so the notion that Langford is saying, well, I'm assuming it's Langford saying you should pay 50%, or maybe it's the school board and Langford. I'm not pointing fingers, but the reality is Langford has a very different tax base than we do as well. So I would argue that fair isn't necessarily 50-50. Fair may well be, it could be 60-40. It could be, something different, based on the tax base of the community, the number of schools, and a lot of other factors. So no, I don't have an axe to grind either way. I think we just should dig into it a little bit. And like you said, maybe seek some time on finding a formula that works. But it's just, it's an interesting subject though.
Thanks very much. We'll move on. Thanks.
Moving along to communications and engagement, this was an area where we did receive direction to increase the level of service provided. And this was specific with respect to the continuation of our volunteer engagement beyond the trial period that was endorsed during last year's service review. And so the operating budget that was presented does include incremental funding to continue this function into perpetuity for the city. Youth engagement, this was a newly defined service area for the city with this year's review. The direction was to maintain this level of service. And specifically what we spoke about during service review was that we would look to maintaining this service beyond the term of the 3-year federal grant. We spoke about the West Shore Parks and Recreation Society. They have acknowledged and incorporated programming funding for this function to continue into the future. And our operating budget includes incremental funding in 2026 and beyond to support the staffing. Events, arts, and culture, we were provided direction to maintain the level of service. We did discuss during service review a consideration of I shouldn't use the word refinement, but we discussed about how we have 2 events throughout the summer months, Music in the Park, and there was consideration given to moving that to a single event. Throughout this year, we did receive direction as well to ensure that we have, sustainable, permanently committed funding towards Indigenous events. And so that has been incorporated into the operating budget in this area as well. With respect to human resources, we did receive direction to increase the level of service in this area. There was a few, from a budgetary perspective, there was a few considerations made that the city has a new union with the IAFF, the departure from the GVLRA and the implications on our team's service delivery. As well, the certificate of recognition that we celebrated this year, and recognizing that we do need to ensure that we work to maintain that certificate, and that there are, audit requirements every 3 years. And so we are looking at increasing resourcing in this area starting in 2026. And the budgetary requirements were highlighted during service review. With respect to IT, we had quite a focus in terms of the financial pressures with respect to both software licensing and the fact that, as we have a number of softwares that are up for renewal and will be major initiatives for the city inside of the next 5 years. So consideration of those pressures are within the 5-year plan, but are impacting us 2026, 2027 in this area. Ultimately, we received direction to maintain the level of service that is happening. And, you know, and I will highlight, we acknowledge that we don't have the clarity yet in terms of the impact that some of our more major, you know, our core financial system conversion, for example. And so my expectation is as we work through a request for information in early 2025, we'll be better positioned to articulate the resourcing requirements a year from now with respect to that transition. Similarly, GIS, direction to maintain the level of service. You know, focus in this area is continuation of our asset management software implementation. The operating budget did receive the required resourcing for that under the 2024 financial plan, and that continues. With respect to finance, we received direction to increase the level of service. And this was related to the discussion and the expectation regarding performance benchmarking systems be established, as well as, you know, one of the challenges in this area was the resourcing of these major software initiatives, many of which directly impact the financial operations of the city. And so the financial implications of an operations analyst being introduced to the city are included within this draft budget for 2025 and into 2026. And I should say later in the evening, when we get into the breakdown of the property tax increase, we'll see directly the tax implications related to the increased levels of service. Health administration, new service area for the city. And really, this is an area that, you know, we, from a budgetary perspective, we spoke about as we open the clinic doors. We certainly will be reviewing that budget in detail. And so the financial updates for this area will be of particular importance, just given the estimates that really went into the determination of how our trial could look. And so as it actualizes, you will be the first to hear the implications of this area. But as you know, we are not looking to generate property tax dollars to support this service. With respect to fire rescue, you know, we had conversations throughout the year, not just in service review, discussing the implications both of the unionization of our team, but also as we continue the transition to a 24-hour staffing model at the fire hall there. So we are looking at about a 1% tax increase to support this service delivery, specifically with the addition of a lieutenant in 2025. With respect to building and bylaw, we will be maintaining the existing service delivery in this area. And this, you know, what was highlighted during service review is from a financial perspective, we absolutely had a peak in activity in late 23 and throughout 2024. And rather than staff up or increase the resourcing, the team really looked at, you know, the restructure and the efficiencies with the tools that are used to deliver that service. And so, you know, from a financial perspective, when you're looking at the revenues, yes, there is a drop in the anticipated revenues, but we're not generating that tax increase in part because of the city's practice of transferring some of those revenues to reserves to avoid the volatility. We've had a number of conversations as well this year about the financial pressures that this community is facing with respect to our policing service delivery. We are maintaining our service delivery, and specifically that means that we will increase our strength by 1 member at the RCMP detachment. We are expecting, you know, an almost 4.73% increase to our taxation in order to maintain our service delivery. That increase is, you know, about 1% is the additional strength. About 2.2% is, of course, the policing dispatch transition. So moving from the federal and the provincial government funding our dispatch costs to what has been communicated to us that South Island municipalities will be responsible for this cost come April 1st, 2025. The impact on our community, as we've mentioned, is about a 3% tax increase for a full year of the dispatch costs. Mr. Mayor, as you know, I mean, we continue conversations. We have one scheduled next week. We are well aware of the inequity in terms of what communities are paying for what with respect to dispatch costs. However, from a budgetary perspective, and given what I raised during service review, my advice is that these costs stay within our operating budget. And my advice is that we look to introduce sustainable funding for this. We have not received clarity with respect to any alternate funding. And from the conversations that I've had with my colleagues throughout the region, it sounds as though most municipalities will be looking to tax for this service in 2025.
Jen, just a quick question on the policing. I've always meant to ask this because I wasn't clear myself. You know, when the URSU is stopping people and everyone's getting fined, where do those dollars go, by the way? Do you know, do they ever come back to the municipalities or?
Sorry, what fines are you
Yeah,
referring to,
just
Mr. Mayor?
like speeding, for example. Does that revenue make its way back to the municipalities somehow?
Yes, so there is a unconditional grant transfer from the provincial government with respect to traffic fine revenue sharing.
Okay.
So ultimately, the net revenues that are generated within our municipal boundaries, they are passed back along to us. We utilize those revenues to support our operations. From a budgetary perspective, they're included within our operating. I believe it's approximately $150,000, $175,000 a year. I'll confirm the number.
Okay, thank you very
But
much.
yes, we do.
Okay, thanks.
What I did want to highlight, as you can see in the top 3 priorities, the determination of participation within the Vancouver Island Integrated Major Crime Unit. Our initial estimates for Colwood's cost related to that is approximately $360,000 a year. Those costs are not currently incorporated into this financial plan. Moving along to our engineering team, we received direction to both maintain service delivery in 2025 and then move to increase service delivery in 2026 with consideration of increased resourcing to support transportation-related functions and with the identification of a transportation engineer proposed for 2026. There is no tax increase required to maintain this service delivery into 2025, given an anticipated increase in the user fees for this area. Development services given direction to maintain service delivery as we move into 2025. Community planning, impact of growth under the 2024 service review saw us increase resourcing in this area with a mid-year hire of an administrative assistant. And so we're realizing the full year cost implications as we move into 2025, and we are moving to maintain service delivery in this area. With respect to public works, this was where we did receive specific direction during the service review that the 2025 holiday weekends be removed from branch drop-off. The operating budget has been updated to adjust the overtime budget that was there to support that activity. What has changed with respect to this operating budget since service review was with consideration of the capital plan, specifically that we're looking to add 4 washrooms within parks. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. This one was with the compilation of the public works operations facility. So as that, of course, is constructed and we take occupancy, we will look to increase our resourcing for facility maintenance. The implications of that will primarily hit in 2026. With respect to boulevards, we're looking to maintain service. However, it was highlighted during service review that in order to do so, we will be looking at the addition of staffing due to the impact of growth in this area. Similar commentary with respect to parks, trails, and recreation. And here, the change with the parks operating budget since service review was with respect to the compilation and the consideration of the new washrooms that are slated, 2 in 2025 and 2 moving into 2026, and to ensure that we have the ability to maintain those new facilities moving forward. We also discussed the pressures with respect to garbage collection within the city and acknowledged the increased resourcing that was required to maintain that service delivery. Similar commentary with respect to our roads team. You heard from our team that we had an increased resourcing. I believe it was close to a decade. And so this year's budget does include that to ensure that we can keep up with the level of service that's currently being provided. With respect to our storm sewers service review, we noted flush and camera program continues. We're looking to maintain service in this area, and we're not proposing any increase in resourcing in order to do so. And last but certainly not least, the city's sewer utility. From a financial perspective, much of the conversation during service review was about the impact on our sewer user fee rates as we continue that funding transition of the CRD's liquid waste management plan on the city's utility. I didn't mean to speak so quickly, but that was the overview of our service areas. And so at this point, recognizing that we really did start this process in late August with the publication of the 2025 budget approach into October and November. And then this week, sort of with the overview, all aspects of our financial plan have been presented on and considered. And what I did want to move into now was an overview of where we are currently sitting with our draft or proposed property tax increase. And so we do endeavor to speak to the 5 years each year as we go through this budget cycle, so that there are no surprises as we move forward. As you know, we've spoken a little about how the financial implications of a decision we may make today, may have an effect multiple years into the future. And so tonight, we'll look both at how we're currently sitting both in this year, 2025, but also what we can anticipate in each of the next 4 years under this draft plan. So a year ago, we approved, ultimately it was a 7.2% increase for 2025. And if we just start at the top of the chart, we were looking at about 2.6% increase just to maintain core city service delivery. It's about 1% increase to add that policing strength. We've been adding a strength per year. We recognize that we did have incremental debt servicing coming on, and that was less than 1% to support that. And then, as you know, we've had these ecom estimates for about 2 years, the original estimate. And so we had incorporated that into the budget. That was another 1.8% increase. Continuing on with that 1% additional tax every year to support our sustainable infrastructure. That was how the 7.2% increase was compiled. We returned later in the year with consideration of the 2025 budget approach. We had done a financial plan amendment at that time, which did have incorporated some of the operating pressures on our budget for our fire rescue service delivery. And so that 7.2 had actually trended up to about 8.3. We discussed in that budget approach a number of tactics to consider a target, and we established a target of about 6.5% increase for this community. The primary driver of that was consideration of utilizing RCMP policing surplus to fund ECOM, recognizing we still don't have great clarity in terms of the obvious inequity there. But that was really how we established that target, as you can see on the chart. At the same time, our team set about reviewing and compiling both our operating and our capital plans. And so the impact on our taxation fluctuated. The far right column is where we sit today. So starting at the top, and we did highlight with our budget approach, we were endeavoring to keep that tax increase to maintain existing services below 4%. And so today we're sitting at a little over 2%, and we're a little over an additional 1% for that policing strength. With respect to consideration during service review, we're looking at another not quite 1% to support the enhanced services, volunteer engagement, the operations analyst, servicing of the new parks washroom facilities. The debt servicing, we initially anticipated participating in a fall 2024 borrow. We're now looking at spring 2025, so we have benefited slightly with reduced interest rates. And so our budget has been updated to incorporate that. ECOM, we received updated costing estimates. And I will be direct, we haven't yet received, in my opinion, great information. We have a number, it's $495,000 for 9 months. And so that impact of the $495,000 equates to the 2.2% increase. And then, recognizing that maintenance of the sustainable infrastructure reserve, there's the additional 1%. And so that's what has us sitting today at 7.9, which in other words is 4.68% increase plus the impact of ECOM plus 1%. Pleased to answer any questions. We will be revisiting this next week with staff recommendations that are coming forward.
Great, thank you. I will open the floor for questions. Councilor Ward.
Jen, just a quick question. The sustainable infrastructure amount, that predates my time here. So am I right in assuming that it's a 12-year plan to achieve kind of the annual goal on that? Is that how it was set out?
Through your worship, yes. So when that plan was introduced in 2019 was the first year that we had that increase. We anticipated that it would be about 12 years until we would close the funding gap, between what we were currently setting aside and what we believe we should be setting aside. Those assumptions have changed somewhat. We reviewed it a little with the introduction of the updated draft plan. We are making great progress because of other policy considerations that we have followed inside of the last 5 years. Specifically, when we've had debt servicing come off the books, with the exception of this year where it's helped us with new debt, we have transferred those dollars into our reserves. We've also protected our investment returns. We've transferred those into reserves. And so that's detail that we certainly want to revisit. As we are working on the direction that we received from Infrastructure Committee, ultimately endorsed by Council this year, to bring that plan forward. But to be direct, yes, it was 12 years that was anticipated to close that.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I'm not suggesting we touch it at all. I was just curious about the lifespan and if that forecast had changed at all. So thank you.
And I think it's a prudent move to recognize the ECOM 9/11 this year for the 9 months. Because in 2026, we only get the balance, right? You can either say, no, we'll just offset it with surplus and then next year take the full 3% in, or 2026, not a wise thing to do. So I agree with this. We never actually approved that as a council yet, but I think if there's an agreement here, I don't think it's an issue here. Any other questions for Jen?
So the next scheduled meeting is Monday. We have just, prior to this meeting, scheduled that package, which really does simply focus on the 4 staff recommendations for council to consider. I mean, to be direct, we're looking for that direction to return with a draft bylaw in the new year for consideration. You can see the impact of this plan moving into year 2, 3, 4, and 5. And what we will highlight a little further is when we consider the full implications of servicing for our city facilities. So specifically, as we introduce, it's an additional 1.3% lift in 2026 for the Public Works Operations Facility. That's an opportunity where we will bring forward consideration of a reminder, we are setting aside X dollars towards city facilities. That came up earlier this week with respect to there is $260,000 in taxation currently being set aside for purposes of the RCMP detachment. That's an example of an opportunity where we may, recognizing the pressures of additional city facility debt servicing and or funding requirements. We spoke about St. John's Church and how we are not sustainably funding that facility right now. But that's an example of, where we could mitigate that year 2 increase by adjusting the reserve transfers slightly. And so I didn't want to leave tonight without saying that because the 2026 service review will be here before we know it. And what I did want to mention publicly, we do currently have meeting time scheduled for Tuesday evening. My expectation is that likely won't be required should Monday afternoon be sufficient to consider the staff recommendations. So I'll raise that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Obviously a great job because, questions. You did phenomenal. Yeah, the whole group just did phenomenal. And I think it's going to be, I just want to sum this up. It's going to be in the messaging. There's not one person, I don't think at this table is going to wear these, the public safety costs, the downloading, not wearing it. I'm going to make sure that's clearly articulated in the way we present it. And I like what you've done. It's just absolutely beautiful. So anyways, on that note, I'll just look for a motion to adjourn. Okay, thank you. And so many, just take your choice. All in favor? Thank you very much, everyone, for attending.